before, but, he was arrested just like all of the others and thrown out of college and banned from basketball for life. One of the guys that I spoke with had, shall we say, a more entrepreneurial view of the situation. He said to me, I would go into the Garden to play and I'd look up at the stands and I'd think, every one of these people paid, 18,000 people, every one of them paid to get in tonight. And where did that money go? Not to me, right? So he felt justified in taking a little bit of money. In a college basketball game at the Garden, everybody in that arena, except for the fans who paid to get in, everybody was in some way deriving income from the games. The college basketball promoter for the Garden, Ned Irish, had gotten rich as a result of these games. When he started promoting games in 1934, he was a sports writer making $48 a week. By this time, he was making $150,000 a year and lived in a large apartment on Park Avenue. All of the people there, the coaches, the referees, the sports writers, the food vendors, the ushers, and the bookmakers, of which there were many in the Garden, they were all making money from the games except for the players, the people whose talent made all the rest of it possible.
Well, that's an issue that has very contemporary resonance when, as of this recording, I believe California passed a state law that NCAA players will be able to receive endorsements. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. Well, starting in 2023.
2023, right. And that's the entire argument right there, that this entire league is built on the backs of these indentured servants that are maybe thrown a degree in communication studies or whatever, when the highest paid public employee in almost every state in the U.S. is the football coach or the basketball coach by far. Well, not to get too ahead of ourselves with editorializing, although I'll save some time at the end of the interview if you're up for it. But based on these former players that you spoke with, were they all across the board on their understanding of the scandal, or did more of them cluster toward this entrepreneurial view that, well, everyone else is making money, so why can't I? Or was there more remorse, a mixture? What was your sense?
There was a tremendous amount of remorse. There was really only one guy that I spoke with that I would say was not remorseful about it, who felt I had it coming to me, I deserved it, I was happy to take the money. There was a tremendous amount of remorse among the players. But even more than that, I think that there was a sense of their being kind of scapegoated, that they were caught up in something that was really much bigger than they were. Their story was really much bigger than they themselves, and they ended up paying the price for it. As I discovered in the book, there were really two bookmaking scandals that were going on simultaneously in New York at that time. There was the basketball scandal, but there was another scandal as well, the Harry Gross scandal. Harry Gross was the most powerful bookmaker in New York. He was taking in, his syndicate was taking in $20 million a year in sports bets, which seems like a lot, which is a lot, but it's even more when you realize that that's worth over $200 million in today's money. And he was protecting himself by laying out $1 million a year in what he called ICE bribes for politicians and for police to keep his syndicate going and prevent them from being arrested. The money was being doled out very openly from the back room of the Dugout Bar and Grill in Brooklyn. Every 2 weeks, the money as regular and dependable as a government paycheck. The police would come in, and Harry's men would shell out, the envelopes full of cash. The detectives from the police commissioner's own private squad would come in literally with an empty bushel basket, and Harry's men would fill it up with cash. How important was the bribe money to the men of the NYPD at that time? Well, in 1949, Harry Gross was a very, very good bookmaker, but he was a very, very bad gambler. But he was a big gambler. And in 1949, he lost a tremendous amount of money gambling in a kind of a gambling binge, and he was no longer able to capitalize his syndicate, and he was afraid of what was going to happen, and he fled to California, to L.A. Finally, he was convinced to come back to New York, and the report was that he was visited in his room in the St. George Hotel in Brooklyn by 3 high-ranking police officials who told him that they had put together $100,000 as a loan for Harry so he could recapitalize his bookmaking syndicate and get the bribe money flowing once again, right? I mean, by that point, the police are no longer just his beneficiaries, they're his business partners. So this was there was a huge amount of corruption in New York in those days, a lot of it centering on sports bookmaking. And, as I was doing my research and I would look at these old newspapers and I would see these 2 bookmaking scandals side by side on the front pages of New York's papers, the Harry Gross scandal ultimately led to the resignation of the mayor, William O'Dwyer, and the police commissioner, William O'Brien. And I began to think, is it possible that there are connections between these 2 scandals? And ultimately, I found out that there were connections, that these young basketball players, without ever really knowing it, without ever really being aware of it, had gotten caught up in a kind of vast web of corruption that they didn't really understand. I called the book The City Game, in part because, basketball is the city game and because it's the game as it was played by City, the City team, City College. But also, the City game is the way that cities work, the way that the whole system of handouts and payoffs and deals that keeps the city going. That's the real game of the city. That's the real city game.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
And I want to get into how this network unravels since it's so widespread. But I really like that you connected these 2 things together, since a lot of historical mistakes can happen when people look at a phenomena in isolation. And with the entanglement of this bookmaking scandal and City College, do you think it was inevitable or almost impossible that they would have been caught up in something like this with how widespread and endemic corruption in sports was at this time?
Well, the players always felt that it was their bad luck that they got caught at this particular moment, because they were convinced, and I think that they're right about this, that this had been going on for a long time and involved a lot of players from a lot of colleges over the course of a lot of years. But, the confluence of events like, the arrest of Harry Gross and the installation of a new kind of crusading district attorney in Brooklyn by the name of Miles McDonald, there was a whole confluence of events that led to the arrest of these players. Ultimately, this scandal spread far beyond New York. There were 14 guys in New York who were arrested from 4 different colleges, and ultimately, players from Kentucky were arrested, and Bradley, which was the number 1 rated school in a basketball program in the country. There was one basketball program in New York, only one, that was left unscathed. The big basketball programs in New York were City College, Long Island University, Manhattan College, and NYU. None of them continue to have major basketball programs as a result of that scandal. But there was one more. There was one more in New York that didn't get touched by the scandal, and that was St. John's University, which does continue to maintain a major basketball program. And, as I've discovered in my research, which draws on some documents that haven't before been publicly revealed, there is, I think, very good reason to believe that St. John's was as deeply involved in the scandal as all of these other local schools, but was protected by a police administration that was overwhelmingly Irish Catholic and very supportive of St. John's, not least of it the police commissioner himself, William O'Brien, who was one of the very close friends of the St. John's coach, Frank McGuire, who was referred to in the papers as the number one St. John's fan in the city and who always sat behind the team bench during home games at the Garden. There were also rumors in those years that there had been the involvement of the very powerful Cardinal of New York, Francis Cardinal Spellman, who was the second most powerful Catholic in the world behind the Pope. He was referred to as the American Pope. And the word among the basketball cognoscenti of the time, those who were in the know, was that St. John's had been saved, as they put it, by divine intervention, meaning the involvement of the cardinal. So the scandal involved a lot of people, and ultimately went up, to really high levels of political power in New York.
That's interesting. You mentioned about St. John's being spared of this due to, I guess, Catholic Irish tribal affiliation. That City College, when they're victorious, they're held up as the symbol of this diverse New York with black players, with Jewish players. But when the chips are down and things go bad, then people aren't so open-minded, but get much more tribal and will take care of their own. But then others are left out in the cold to fend for themselves. Would you say that that's right, or do you think there's more to it?
Well, that's certainly the way that it was perceived by the people who were involved at that time. That a lot of the players and their friends and their relatives, said things more or less along the lines of, ultimately it was the black guys and the Jewish guys who got caught. It was black guys who went to prison. And, the Catholic players kind of skated through. I can't say that is due to ethnic tribalism or, what have you, but I can tell you that that's the case. That is what happened. The two most talented of the players who were involved in the scandal, Ed Warner of City College and Sherman White of Long Island University, who was about to get drafted in the first round by the New York Knicks, they were the only two guys who went to prison, and both of them are African American. They were two of only four African Americans who were involved in the scandal. And after their time in prison, their careers were done for. Warner was going to go to the Celtics, White was going to go to the Knicks, but that never happened.
I'd like to look at the process by which this vast gambling syndicate was undone. And you mentioned Brooklyn District Attorney Miles McDonald. How does he undo this when it seems like every single plainclothes policeman in the entire city is involved? I have no idea where you would even begin.
Well, nobody did. And McDonald came up with a kind of ingenious scheme that he had to convince his associates to go along with, because as you say, it really seemed like all of the plainclothes policemen in the city were involved in this. And ultimately, a new police commissioner who finally comes in later on ends up busting all of the plainclothes detectives in New York back to uniform duty, every single one of them, I think it was 300 and something of them, because he felt that the unit was just so deeply corrupted that it had to be a kind of wholesale overhaul of the program. But what Miles McDonald does, it was sort of incredible, and it kind of was a precursor of like Serpico, He says, who on the force is uncorrupted? Well, it doesn't seem like any of the current cops are, or we certainly can't be sure of that. And so what he does is he sends his two top guys, his two top prosecutors, to the police academy, and they interview all of the graduates or the prospective graduates of the police academy. And they end up choosing 29 rookie cops who have been not yet tainted by involvement with bookmakers and gangsters and so forth. And they take these 29 guys under their wing, for their own purposes. And these rookies go undercover has college students, and as a way of identifying the bookmakers who were preying on college campuses. And ultimately, through a long